Arrakis is where Dune stops being a family saga and becomes a struggle for the Empire itself. The planet may seem remote, but spice ties it to trade, travel, politics, and power across known space. Whoever controls Arrakis controls the flow of spice, and that control can shape the fate of every great house, including the Atreides. That is why the timeline matters. Dune is not just a chain of events on one desert world, it is the history of how Arrakis became the center of a larger conflict. House after house, ruler after ruler, and faction after faction are drawn toward the same prize, and every later turning point grows out of that struggle. Before the fall, Arrakis is already unstable because too many powers depend on controlling it. House Harkonnen holds the planet in practice, but never in any secure sense. Their rule rests on imperial approval, extraction, and fear. Arrakis produces the spice, but it is costly to govern and hard to defend. That makes it priceless, and that same value makes it vulnerable. Every shipment, every delay, and every change in production shifts the balance of power far beyond the desert. The Harkonnens have treated Arrakis as a source of profit, not a place to build. They know how to squeeze it and keep spice moving, but they do not have lasting loyalty from the people there, or a political base strong enough to withstand pressure from the Emperor and the other great houses. Arrakis is an asset, but it is also a trap. Anyone who holds it becomes exposed to sabotage, resentment, and enemy attention. Even basic control depends on imported machinery, guarded routes, and accepting constant losses, because the environment erodes authority as quickly as politics does. House Atreides enters that situation as something different. Duke Leto Atreides has a reputation for discipline and honor, but in imperial politics that makes him dangerous. He is respected, he inspires loyalty, and he looks like a long-term threat to his rivals. In the Imperium, that matters more than morality. The Emperor does not need the Atreides to collapse in open war, he only needs them to become too influential. Leto's strength is not just military, it is social. People choose to follow him, and that kind of loyalty is harder to break than fear. So the transfer of Arrakis from Harkonnen control to Atreides control is never just a routine handoff. On paper, it is a legal fief. In practice, it is a move in a larger power struggle. The Harkonnens want revenge. The Emperor wants the Atreides contained. The spice economy needs production to continue without interruption. And the Fremen, who know the desert better than anyone, remain outside the assumptions of imperial rule. The new rulers are stepping onto a planet where official authority is only one layer of reality, and not the strongest one. That is what makes Arrakis so unstable before the main conflict begins. It is a resource center and a pressure point at the same time. No house can hold it casually. No ruler can ignore it. Even a small shift on Arrakis can echo through the Imperium because spice is tied to travel, trade, and political leverage. The planet turns strategy into risk. Whoever controls the spice can influence commerce, navigation, and the movement of power itself, which is why every major player watches it so closely, and why every setback there becomes a political event. When Duke Leto accepts Arrakis, he knows the assignment is dangerous, but he does not yet know how carefully the trap has been prepared. Paul and Jessica come with him, and that moves the story from court politics to immediate family survival. The Atreides are no longer only a rising house with enemies in the background. They are on the ground inside the system that is meant to break them. From that point on, betrayal is no longer a distant possibility. It is the next step in the timeline. The trap is already in place by the time House Atreides settles on Arrakis. On paper, the Emperor has transferred the planet to Duke Leto by decree. In practice, the move is meant to isolate him. The Harkonnens leave behind a world stripped for profit, a bitter population, and a workforce with little reason to trust a new ruling house. The Emperor is not standing above the conflict as a neutral arbiter either. He is allowing a rival great house to be placed in a position where it can be broken, because the Imperium survives on the appearance of order, not fairness. Arrakis has always been dangerous, but now that danger has been organized, Leto sees enough of the pattern to understand the risk. He tries to build ties with the Fremen, and to make House Atreides look like something other than another outside power coming to exploit the planet. That matters, because cooperation with the people who actually live in the desert is the only real path to stable rule. But the Harkonnens still control much of the hidden structure beneath the surface, and they now have imperial backing behind them. The Atreides are forced to manage military defense, political legitimacy, and spice production at the same time, in a place where nearly everyone knows the terrain better than they do. Even their good intentions become a weakness because sincerity cannot compensate for isolation. That is the condition the conspiracy depends on. The Harkonnens do not need to keep Arrakis openly once they have arranged for someone else to inherit the burden of governing it. Damaged equipment, sabotage, strained loyalties, and a hostile local system all remain in place. Spice harvesting depends on timing, logistics, and control of the desert routes, so even small disruptions quickly become major losses. The Atreides arrive on a world whose economy has already been turned into a weapon. They are not taking over neutral ground. They are walking into a trap made from delay, resentment, and hidden access. When the assault begins, it moves with overwhelming force. What follows is not just a battle, but the collapse of an entire command structure. The Atreides are outnumbered, their defenses have been compromised, and the betrayal from within matters just as much as the attack from outside. The fall of House Atreides happened so quickly because the goal was never to defeat them in a fair contest. The goal was to remove them before they could settle in, build allies, and become a real challenge to the old order. In Dune, that kind of collapse is never just personal. Noble houses are political systems, and when one falls, the whole Imperium has to adjust. The Sardaukar presence, hidden behind Harkonnen force, makes that even clearer. This is not simply a house feud, it is an imperial operation disguised as one. For Paul and Jessica, the attack becomes a fight to survive almost at once. They are cut off from formal power and pushed into the desert, where rank means almost nothing and adaptation means everything. This is the moment when House Atreides stops being enough to protect them. Paul is no longer a ducal heir inside the system. He is a hunted young man on a hostile planet, and Jessica has to rely on training and discipline that once served her in court, but now matter far more in the open desert. Their escape is not a clean victory or a planned retreat. It is a break from the world they knew. It also exposes a hard truth. Noble status means very little when the environment itself is against you. That escape pushes Paul toward the Fremen, and that changes the direction of the story. Once he and Jessica vanish into the desert, Arrakis is no longer just a disputed imperial assignment. The Fremen become the only real path forward for Paul's survival. They are central to the planet because they understand its rules, water discipline, movement across open sand, and the limits outsiders keep failing to respect. Paul cannot rebuild using the systems that have already collapsed around him. The alliance he could not secure through official channels may still happen through exile, but now it will be driven by necessity rather than diplomacy. By the end of the betrayal, the old balance is gone. House Atreides has been shattered, the Harkonnen plan has succeeded, and the struggle over Arrakis has entered a new phase. Paul and Jessica are no longer trying to govern a hostile world as members of an imperial house. They are survivors moving into the deep desert, where the Fremen and the spice economy will shape everything that comes next. The fall of the Atreides is not only a family disaster or a military defeat, it is the moment Arrakis shifts from a contested appointment to the center of a much larger power struggle, one that will be decided by those who can endure the planet and control what everyone else needs. Paul's time among the Fremen is where Arrakis stops being only a place of defeat and starts becoming the center of a larger political shift. The Fremen are not just a hiding place. They are the one major power on the planet outside the normal reach of the Imperium, and the great houses badly underestimate them. They know how to cross open sand, conserve water, and survive in conditions that kill outsiders fast. Just as important, they live by discipline, scarcity, and memory. Paul is not simply slipping into a crowd. He is entering a society that can test him, judge him, and reshape him. His first advantage is practical. Paul arrives with noble training and the instincts of someone who has just watched his house collapse. Jessica brings Bene Gesserit training, which helps both of them read Fremen customs faster than an ordinary outsider could. But the deeper reason Paul begins to take root is that the Fremen already have room in their worldview for prophecy. Imperial rule has ignored them for generations, but they have not been cut off from outside belief. Traders, missionaries, and off-world institutions have left traces behind, and those traces matter. The Fremen have legends that leave space for a promised outsider, and Paul's arrival fits that pattern almost immediately. That does not make the change automatic. Paul still has to earn trust, prove himself useful, and learn the desert on the desert's terms. He takes a new name, joins Fremen life, and begins mastering the customs that define status among them. Water is treated as life itself, and every act is measured against that fact. In this setting, his old title means less than whether he can adapt over time. He does. He learns their methods, their fighting style, and the harsh discipline that lets them endure a world other civilizations can barely occupy. This is the point where the Atreides heir starts to disappear, and Muad'Dib begins to emerge. Jessica's path reinforces that transformation. She enters Fremen society not as a ruler, but as an outsider who still has to submit to the community around her. Her training and her status give her leverage, but the desert still demands respect. The Fremen are not impressed by noble blood alone. They only recognize strength once it has been tested by reality. That is one reason Paul's relationship with them becomes so powerful. He is not simply taken in by the Fremen, he is tested by them, shaped by them, and made legible through their expectations. Once that happens, the prophecy around him stops being rumor and becomes political force. Muad'Dib becomes more than a name. It becomes a banner. Among the Fremen, Paul's identity starts to carry religious weight, and that weight grows because the conditions for it already exist. The people of Arrakis have lived for generations under outsiders who want spice, profit, and control. They have little reason to believe change will come from the same imperial system that has always overlooked them. Paul steps into that gap. He can speak the language of the off-world elite and the desert tribes, and that combination gives him rare influence. He understands the machinery of empire while also earning loyalty from a people the empire cannot easily reach. The Spice War turns that loyalty into strategy. Arrakis is the only source of melange, and melange is what keeps the imperial system functioning. It supports travel, commerce, and the balance of power among the great houses. Whoever controls Arrakis can shape the rest of the universe without conquering it in the usual way. Paul understands this better than most of his enemies. The Fremen know the terrain, and he learns how to turn that advantage into pressure on the spice supply itself. Once spice production is threatened, the Emperor and the great houses are no longer dealing with a local rebellion. They are facing a crisis that reaches into the center of imperial life. That shift matters because the Fremen are not just fighters. They are organized, patient, and spread through the deep desert in a way that makes them hard to root out. Their siege system gives them shelter, structure, and a chain of loyalty that imperial forces cannot easily map. That means Paul is not building power from scratch. He is joining a network that already knows how to survive occupation. Once he understands how they move, how they communicate, and how they strike, their resistance stops being scattered raiding and starts becoming a coordinated campaign. The desert itself becomes an ally, because the Fremen can move through it in ways the Sardaukar and Harkonnen forces cannot easily match. Paul's rise also depends on how the Empire misrids him. To his enemies, he is a displaced nobleman and a possible nuisance. They do not fully grasp how quickly a symbol can become a weapon on Arrakis. In a place where water is counted, every success matters and every failure is remembered. Paul's victories among the Fremen therefore carry more than personal importance. They prove that he can live by the rules of the planet, not just the rules of house politics. Each step deeper into desert life makes him harder to dismiss and easier to rally around. The same people who once saw him as an outsider begin to see him as a leader who can turn their survival into power. That is where Paul's rise becomes unmistakable. He is no longer just surviving among the Fremen. He is becoming the figure around whom their military and religious power gathers. The prophecy gives him authority. The desert gives him an army. The spice gives him leverage. Together, those three things are enough to challenge the Imperium itself. By the time Paul fully becomes Muad'Dib, he is no longer just the exiled son of House Atreides. He is the leader of a movement with the power to threaten the throne, and that turns Arrakis from a place of loss into the center of the next war. Once Paul has the Fremen behind him, the conflict stops being a local uprising and becomes a struggle over the whole imperial system. The Imperium looks solid from a distance, but it rests on a few weak supports: the Emperor's authority, the great house's obedience, the guild's transport monopoly, and the constant flow of spice from Arrakis. Paul understands that if Arrakis slips out of their control, those supports begin to fail. The war on the desert world matters because it is not only about territory, it is about breaking the structure that keeps every major power in place. The fighting expands through raids, sabotage, and pressure on spice production, but the deeper shift is that Paul now commands something his enemies cannot easily replace. He has the loyalty of the Fremen, a people shaped by Arrakis and hardened into a fighting force the Imperium badly underestimated. He also gains political authority through the Bene Gesserit prophecy many Fremen already accept. That makes him more than a rebel leader. He becomes the center of a new order forming inside the old one. From there, every attack on the spice fields and every disruption in trade carries consequences that reach far beyond Arrakis. As the violence spreads, the old balance starts to fail. The Emperor can raise armies, but he cannot simply absorb the loss of spice production. The great houses may fear Paul, but they remain trapped by their dependence on spice and by the danger of moving against him too quickly. In Dune, power is never just firepower. It is access, dependence, and timing. Paul understands that Arrakis gives him all three. The more the Empire needs spice, the more every decision circles back to him. Even without conquering world after world, he can force the entire system to react to one planet under his control. That is what makes the final stage of the war decisive. Paul no longer has to prove that he can survive on Arrakis. He has to prove that he can hold the Empire hostage to it. The conflict reaches its peak when the Emperor is forced to face the truth that Paul is not an isolated desert commander anymore. He leads a force capable of threatening the throne itself. At that point, the war is not only against House Atreides' enemies, it is against the structure that put those enemies above them in the first place. The scale of the conflict comes from that collapse, because the outcome will decide who controls the most important commodity in the known universe and who gets to set the rules around it. When Paul finally defeats the Emperor and takes the throne, the victory comes through Arrakis more than through conventional conquest. He does not win by marching across the Empire house by house. He wins by controlling the resource the Empire cannot function without. That is what makes his rise so disruptive. He becomes Emperor by overturning the logic of imperial power rather than inheriting it in the usual way. The throne moves because the spice moves, and the spice moves because Arrakis is in Paul's hands. The final outcome is military, economic, political, and religious all at once, because whoever controls the desert also controls the terms under which the rest of the galaxy can survive. By the end of the war, Paul stands at the center of the Imperium, but the result is not a clean restoration of order. It is a new order built on fear, prophecy, and dependence. The old regime is gone, yet the forces that made it vulnerable are still there. Arrakis still controls the flow of spice. The Fremen still hold the military power that made Paul's rise possible. And the rest of the galaxy now lives under a ruler who knows exactly how fragile civilization becomes when the desert world changes hands. The war for the Empire is over in name, but its consequences shape everything that follows, because Paul's victory does not end the struggle over Arrakis. It proves Arrakis was the real center of the struggle all along. Paul's victory solves one crisis and creates another. The old balance of power collapses, but the galaxy does not become stable just because the Emperor is gone. The deeper problem remains unchanged. Everyone still needs spice, and almost no one can live without the system built around it. Ships need navigation. Great houses need trade. The political class needs spice flowing to keep the machine running. And because Arrakis is still the only source that matters, control of the planet still means control of civilization. That is what makes Paul's rule unusual. He does not simply inherit an empire and sit on top of it. He inherits one already shattered by the thing he used to win it. The Fremen are no longer only a hidden desert people. They are a military force with a reputation strong enough to frighten the rest of the Imperium. Their power came from Arrakis, from the discipline of desert life, and from Paul's ability to turn belief into political action. But that same power also means the Empire now has to fear the cost of resisting him. Paul's throne is built less on ordinary loyalty than on the knowledge that spice, the Fremen armies, and interstellar travel all depend on the desert world he controls. This is why the aftermath of his rise matters. In the short term, Paul brings order through force. The Imperium cannot ignore him because it cannot function without Arrakis. In the long term, though, that dependence becomes a trap. Any ruler tied to spice is tied to scarcity, and any ruler tied to prophecy is tied to expectations that can outgrow politics. Paul understands this better than almost anyone. He knows Arrakis is not only an economic center, it is religious, cultural, and strategic all at once. The planet shapes belief because it shapes survival. Whoever governs it can decide who moves freely, who profits, who travels, and who starves. That is the long shadow of spice. It is not just a resource, it is the condition that holds the civilization of Dune together. The guild's dependence on it, the nobility's dependence on it, and the Fremen's identity around it all make Arrakis more than a planet on a map. It becomes the point where every major force in the setting meets. Before Paul, that dependence was managed through diplomacy, monopolies, and fear of disruption. After Paul, it is exposed as the real foundation of imperial authority. The throne changes hands, but the source of its power stays buried in the sand. By the end of this timeline, Arrakis is still doing what it has always done. It sets the limits of empire. It shapes belief. It determines who can rule and how far that rule can reach. Paul's reign proves that control of spice can overturn an entire political order, But it also shows that no one escapes the world built around it. The Empire changes because Arrakis changes it, and as long as spice remains essential, the desert planet will keep deciding humanity's future. By the later turning points, the pattern is clear. Every major faction faces the same truth. Arrakis controls the spice, and spice controls the Empire. That is why the Atreides' rise matters, and why their fall matters even more. Their story is not only a family tragedy, it marks the moment the struggle for Arrakis becomes a struggle over the future of human civilization. Paul's rule sharpens that truth. He does not end the system built around spice. He exposes how complete it already is. The throne, the guild, the noble houses, and the religious movement around Muad'Dib all depend on the same desert world. That is the core of Dune's timeline. Wars change hands and rulers change names, but Arrakis stays at the center. It remains the source of power, belief, and the Empire itself.